When they which were about him saw that what would follow, they said unto him, Lord, shall we smite with the sword? So this is in the book of Luke, where it seems that some of the disciples, at least one of them, wants to have some type of defense, wants to violently defend the honor of Jesus. It seems that is Peter. Peter, in John 18, we're told in verse 10, then taking a sword, draws it and smote the high priest's servant, cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. All right, so there's a lot going on, what seems all at once. I think this is, in my head, this is kind of how the timeline plays out. As Judas is walking up to the group of Jesus and his disciples, it seems that Jesus begins to walk towards them. Jesus does not wait for them to arrive. In Mark 14, verse 44, we read, and he that betrayed him had given them a token, saying, whomsoever shall I kiss, that same is he. Take him and lead him away. As soon as he was come, he goeth straightway to him and say, Master, Master, and kissed him. Luke 22 tells us that as he drew near to kiss Jesus, Jesus speaks unto him and saying, why do you betray me with a kiss? Now let's go to Matthew 26. In Matthew 26, verse 48, we see, now that he betrayed him, gave them a sign, saying, whosoever I shall kiss. Verse 49, forthwith he came to Jesus, said, Hail, Master, kissed him. And Jesus said unto him, Friend, wherefore art thou come? Then they came and laid hand on Jesus and took him. The gospel that seems to give some more details than the rest is John 18. And those details are when Jesus says, who do you seek? So the question is, does Jesus speak before or after the kiss of Judas? Because in John 18, we don't have the benefit of knowing when Judas kisses Jesus. It's not even mentioned. What is mentioned from the Apostle John is essentially what Jesus did and what Peter did. John chooses to not mention what Judas does. The other Gospels, all three, mention what Judas does and doesn't really tell us about this account that John mentions of Judas speaking and them falling. In my mind's eye, what I picture is if Jesus says, whom do you speak? I believe he says it before the kiss. So I believe as they're coming up, Jesus is walking to them. He says, who do you seek? And they say, Jesus. And he says, I am he. They fall down. They get back up again. He asks again, whom do you seek? They say, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus says, I told you that I am he. If therefore you seek me, let these go their way. And then I picture Judas kissing Jesus at that point. Judas did not betray Jesus, in my opinion, before Jesus had already stated who he was. And I think, personally, that's a pretty important truth to make. It wasn't that Jesus was betrayed, although he was. It would not have mattered. Judas did not need to betray Jesus. Judas didn't need to kiss Jesus on the cheek, in a sense. Jesus was marching to the group and willing to give himself up even before Judas kissed him on the cheek. Then I see, in my mind's eye, Judas kissing Jesus on the cheek anyways, even after Jesus says, I am he. Maybe Judas is confused. Judas obviously was very clear to the priest's guards that arrest the one I kissed, so it might have been a little awkward, but Judas thought, I better go through with it because they might not believe this is Jesus. They might think he's tricking them, so Judas kisses him anyways. Then Jesus says, why are you betraying me with the kiss? Then I believe Jesus looks to the guards and says, let these go. But before they run off, and they will run off, Peter takes out his sword and he says, let's defend you. He cuts off the ear of a servant, Malchus, before Jesus responds. After the ear is cut off, verse 11, Jesus says, put up thy sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me shall I not drink. Then the band and the captain and the officers and Jews took Jesus, bound him, led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. A lot of things are going to happen in the next hours. And what seemed like could be drawn out over days is actually less, significantly less than one day. So Jesus is brought first to Annas, the not even the high priest, the father-in-law to the high priest. I think not much has changed over the years when it's not just the politicians. And the high priest was, in a sense, a politician. He was a leader, in a sense, spoke on behalf of the people, was expected to uphold the law and to represent the people while also doing the work of the priest. But he was a spiritual leader, and in that way, he was a politician, you might say, for the Jews. But just like today, it's not just the politicians that have power, but even their close friends and their family have power, right? And even back then, the father-in-law to the high priest had a lot of power, had a lot of sway. And so Jesus is brought before the father-in-law, Annas, first. And let's go now to, verse 13. So led him to Caiaphas. After this, let him wait first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas. Now Caiaphas, we talked about who Caiaphas was, the high priest. Verse 15, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest and went with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. This is, of course, John. So John is the one who knows the high priest. I had stated long before when we began the study of the Gospels, when I was talking about the apostles, that it seems John's family was very well connected. That John's family obviously knew the high priest. He knew Caiaphas because it says right here that his family knew them. And John left a lot of privilege and a lot of power, a lot of money as well. John's family was the one whose father owned a fishing business and left behind multiple servants with multiple ships. John was living a pretty good life. And he left that to wander the nation of Israel, you might say, for 3 years with Jesus. That's a lot of commitment. It's a lot of dedication. John is using some of his influence now to get in closer to what's going on with Jesus, and also uses his influence to get Peter closer as well. So Peter doesn't go all the way into the trial like John does. He kind of stands in the outer courtyard, and it is there, standing in the outer courtyard, that Peter is confronted on 3 occasions. So, of course, you know the story. Peter, every time he's confronted with a question, not asked the same way, but in the same way, are you with Jesus? Each time he denies it. Verse 17, then saith the damsel that kept the door to Peter, art thou not also one of this man's disciples? He says, I am not. The servants and officers stood there who made a fire and coals, for it was cold. They warmed themselves. Peter stood with them and warmed him. The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. So at this point, in John 18, verse 19, Jesus has had his first meeting with Annas. Whatever happened with Annas, whatever was said with Annas is done, and he's brought now into Caiaphas. Maybe Annas passed some information on to Caiaphas and gave Caiaphas, here's my thoughts after meeting with Jesus briefly. And Caiaphas is now overseeing the beginnings of a trial with Jesus. And he says, tell us about yourself. Who are you? Jesus in verse 20 says, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me, what have I said unto them? Behold, they know what I said. Jesus is responding to Caiaphas with some pretty extreme boldness. Caiaphas is basically saying, defend yourself in this trial. I would imagine at some point Jesus was told publicly or privately why he was arrested. Whether Jesus asked why or not, the Bible doesn't tell us. I don't think that he did. Jesus knows what's going on. But I think someone would have told Jesus, all right, you are here for blasphemy. You are here claiming to be the Son of God, equal with God himself, because that is essentially what's going on. Then Caiaphas states, now you defend yourself. Tell us, give us reason to not arrest you. Give us reason to not put you to death. What do you say about yourself? And Jesus essentially says, I have nothing to say that I haven't already said. I have nothing new to add that I haven't spoken publicly before all. If you want to really know what I've said about myself, why don't you ask other people? He's basically, in my opinion, stating, I'm not going to play your game. I'm not going to sit here and play along with your fake trial. I know where this is headed, so let's just get this done with. Well, Caiaphas, of course, does bring in witnesses. As you read through the Gospels, you're going to find that witnesses are brought. And it's interesting that all of those witnesses that are brought are not able to agree with each other. Now, in Jewish law, to be condemned of a crime, it had to be in the mouth of 2 or 3 agreeing witnesses. Jesus is not condemned lawfully. Under the law of Israel, Jesus could not and should not have been put to death. The witnesses were brought in, and there was at least 2 or 3, but they did not agree with each other on what Jesus said. So let's take a look at verse 19. The high priest says in Jesus, "What is your doctrine?" Jesus speaks and says, "Why don't you ask other people?" They know. Verse 22, when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, "Thou answerest the high priest so." And Jesus answered him, "If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil, but if well, why smitest thou me?" Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas the high priest. Now it's kind of a backward statement. He's already speaking to the high priest, but basically what's being said is, as Jesus is being hit, he's bound. So when verse 24 is being given, it's saying essentially Jesus had come bound and is bound and was hit while he was bound. Which just shows you the cruel nature of the guards, shows you the cruel nature of the high priest, that they would hit a man who cannot defend himself. Then we're brought back outside to Peter in verse 25, standing outside warming himself. And one says, "Art not thou also one of his disciples?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off. This guy was related to Malchus. He said, "Did not I see thee in the garden with him? Aren't you the guy that cut off the ear of my cousin or my nephew or my uncle, whoever it was?" And Peter denied again, and immediately the cock crew. Now we're actually told in other Gospels, Peter begins to swear. Now, I don't personally know if when the Bible says he begins to swear, that means he's like swearing swear words, or basically on the grave of my grandfather, I am not with Jesus. On the honor of my tribe, I'm not with Jesus. Personally, that's what I think is going on. I don't think Peter's using swear words. I think that word swear in the Bible is closer, probably connected to the fact that Peter is saying, what do I need to convince you I'm not with him? Like, whose life, whose grave do I need to promise that I'm not with Jesus? And it was after that point, which for a Jew at that time to essentially say, on my honor, I swear by the temple, I swear by Israel itself. And remember, earlier in the Gospels, Christ told the disciples not to swear on the temple, not to swear on anything. He said, just basically let your yes be yes and your no be no, right? Because that was a big thing. The Jews would think that you could lie unless you swore on something that was important to you. Then you could be trusted. And Peter swears on something that is important to him. So for his culture, he's basically saying, I'm telling you the truth. You can trust me. And then the rooster crows. And Peter, after swearing on whatever he chose to swear on, his family, the temple, whatever it might be, he is reminded that he was going to do this thing. He's reminded that he told Jesus he would never do this thing. And this is when Peter, we're told, runs away in tears. He is distraught. Extreme anxiety, extreme sadness and sorrow, knowing that he had failed Jesus just like Jesus warned him that he would. I think that many of us can sympathize with Peter. The many times we've failed Jesus, the many times we've done and said things we know were opposite of what a Christian should say and do. I think a lot of Christians struggle with the idea that someone who's truly saved could actually say this, could actually say and swear, I'm not with Jesus. Is Peter even saved here? Can someone be saved and say, I'm not a Christian? When I was young in college, I remember thinking often about martyrdom and what that would look like for me. The reason was I was majoring in missions. I fully intended to go overseas, and I got to be frank with you, I fully intended to be dead long before 40 years old. Like, I was a young, zealous, college-age guy. I had been reading the missionary stories, been going to preaching. I just thought, all right, I'm going to go on the mission field, and I'll probably won't survive, 30 or 40 years old. I'll probably die young, and I was committing my life to the Lord. So I thought often on what that might look like for me. And I thought, what would happen if I'm confronted with death? Would I have the courage to say I'm with Jesus? Or would I deny him? And I thought, if I do deny him, does that mean I would never have been saved, or does that affect my salvation? And I studied a lot on this part of Scripture, Peter, and just kind of overall salvation, because I thought on it so much. I've come to the conclusion a long time ago that I firmly believe Peter was saved. When you see Jesus saying things like the Spirit of God has revealed that to you, and commenting and commending Peter so often for Peter's faith and his statements that he made, Peter walking on water. I believe we're looking at a saved individual, but a saved individual who had given into a moment of the flesh, extreme fear. And he allowed his fear to direct his actions, his conversations, his statements, rather than his faith. It wasn't that the faith wasn't there, but he chose fear over faith. And I believe Christians today are just as capable as they were 2,000 years ago of choosing fear over faith. And if you choose fear, it doesn't mean the faith doesn't exist. It means you made the wrong decision. And fear will most definitely take you down a path of self-destruction, as we see with Peter. A path of depression, a path of regret, anxiety. Faith may lead to some martyrdom, as we've seen with many Christians over the thousands of years of church history. Many Christians have been asked this question, are you with Christ? And many have said yes, and have been killed immediately following. Still happens today across the world, although we don't hear about it. But even in the United States, in Colorado, what was it, about 20 years ago now? A young girl was asked in school, as a young man walked around with a gun, asking people questions. He comes to this young girl and he asks her, are you a Christian? And she says yes, and he shoots her. I remember reading that story when I was a young man. It still happens today. And I wonder what would be my answer. I'd like to believe, I'd like to hope that I would stand strong, as strong in the moment of my death as I have been in the moment of my life. But Peter also wanted to believe that and was adamant that he would. And when he failed, he was full of sorrow, which also I think is a sure sign of his salvation. I will say this about Peter. We don't have record of Peter ever doing that again. And church history does record for us that the next time Peter is confronted with that choice, he courageously accepts the death penalty. And then something very amazing. As Peter is told how he will die, church history records for us that Peter requests that instead of being hung on a cross, that he is hung upside down, because he does not deserve the honor of dying like his Lord, is what he says. He's willing to die for God, but he doesn't want to die like Christ. He doesn't think he deserves that honor. Pretty amazing. So Peter learns from this mistake and doesn't seem to ever repeat it again. All right, so we're in John, and let's take a look now at verse 18 and verse 28. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early, and they themselves went not into judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out unto them and said, what accusation bring ye against this man? They answered and said unto him, if he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him unto thee. Then said Pilate unto them, take ye him and judge him according to your law. The Jews said unto him, it is not lawful for us to put him into death. Now that's interesting, because the Jews most definitely are capable of killing people. In fact, we're going to find not much longer after this, there's a young man named Stephen who's a deacon who upsets the Jews, and they take him outside and stone him to death. So what they say, although it is true, it hasn't necessarily kept them from killing people before. And it won't keep them from killing people in the future, like Stephen. So, although the Romans had a law that essentially they were to determine the death penalty, the Jews here, wanting the Romans to dirty their hands, the Pharisees do not. I believe, just like the Pharisees didn't want to go in the garden, the Pharisees didn't want to put Jesus on the cross. The Pharisees could have had Jesus put to death, again, like they have others with Stephen, but they don't want to be attached to this decision. Why? They're hoping they come out of all this clean. The Pharisees don't want to get their hands dirty with the decision that they are forcing, essentially, on Pilate. So, verse 30, they answered unto him, if you were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him unto thee. Verse 32, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. Then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again and called Jesus, said unto him, art thou the King of the Jews? Jesus answered him, sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell thee of me? Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Thine own nation and the chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? Jesus is basically saying, this question you asked me, where'd you get it? And Pilate says, I don't even know you, man. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm only asking you based off of the information that was just given to me by your own countrymen. Your people want you dead, Pilate says. I could care less. I don't need you dead. You tell me. And he's saying, give me a reason, basically, to not put you to death. Jesus gives him the answer, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were of this world, they would my servants fight, and I should not be delivered to the Jews. Verse 37, Pilate therefore said unto him, art thou a king then? Jesus said, thou sayest that I am a king, to this end was I born. And for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Verse 38, Pilate saith unto him, what is truth? And when he said this, he went out again unto the Jews and said to them, I find no fault at all. What is truth? Pilate was battling the same questions people battle today. What is truth? Who is truth? Where can you find truth? Pilate, I think, had the same lessons taught to him that many students do today, and that is there is no absolute truth. Truth is relative. Truth is what you make of it. This lesson, this false deception of truth has been around for thousands of years. You look at the philosophers in Greek philosophy that predates Christ, and you see some of the writings of the ancient philosophers, and they're asking the same question, is there truth? Can you discover truth? Is truth real? Because outside of God, I actually would state it makes sense that there is no absolute truth. If there is no God, there's no absolute morality. If there's no God, there's no absolute truth. Consider this. If we are all here by chance, and aside from God, that's the only answer, that there is some chance, some natural phenomenon. Now, I'm not saying evolution makes sense. Even outside of God, evolution does not make sense to me. But some natural phenomenon has taken place outside of God. Then who gets to decide what's true and what's not true? If there's not one person who started it all, if there's not a creator, then essentially we are equally here by chance. Which of us gets to decide what is true? Your opinion is just as powerful to you as my opinion is to me. And someone else's opinion has just as much justification to be right as mine does. And so if there is no God, there is no truth. Absolute morality is the idea of is there an absolute always right and an absolute always wrong? Did you know there's people who actually do not believe in absolute morality? I've spoken with them. There are people who literally believe that just because our society says it's wrong doesn't mean it's wrong somewhere else. And I say, are you kidding me? Can you mention to me anything that you think might be wrong no matter where you are? And they say, no, I can't think of anything. And I say, seriously, okay, let me give you one. Rape. When is rape? In what culture is rape ever justified? I remember speaking with a young man. He was a very bright young man. This is about 4 years ago. He was a sharp guy, college graduate, smart guy, mid-20s, and he was by far not an idiot. And he said, I can't think of anything that would be an absolute morality no matter where you went. And I used rape, and I said, I'll even get it here further. How about the rape of a child? I mean, let's just go all the way down, right? Rape of a child. In what culture is that okay? You know what his response was? He said, well, what if the world depended on that action? I said, in what reality does the life of the world depend on the rape of a child? But I said, all right, let's play your game. Let's pretend that the lives of millions of people are at stake. And unless someone rapes this child, millions are going to die. I said, the rape still isn't okay. You just have two evils. The murder of millions and rape. They're both evil. One is not good because the other one depends on the first. They're both evil. And he didn't really have an answer to that. But there are people in the world who really believe there's no absolute morality. And they would give similar response and sometimes no response because there is no response. If there's no God, then whatever you want goes. And that's truly what they believe. Well, I may not like it, but, some cultures like different things than me. Oh, come on, man. I mean, there's so many other things you could use than rape, but I feel like that should be an obvious one. You know why there's an absolute morality? Do you know why rape is always wrong? Do you know why taking the life of the innocent is always wrong? I understand that sometimes innocent people die in war, and I understand that sometimes war has to happen. Taking the life of innocent people in war, accident on purpose, doesn't make it right. It's just inevitably is another evil of war. And war is a consequence of the evilness of our hearts. Now, I understand that sometimes war has to happen. I get it, that the evil had to be confronted, and that's war because that's the only way they understand. And people die in war, and a lot of times people die in war that shouldn't die. But that's an evil. That's not a good thing. We shouldn't say, well, it's no big deal. No, it's a big deal. And it should sadden our hearts, the atrocities that happen in war. We shouldn't call them good just because the war is necessary. The war can be necessary, and the other things can still be evil in the war. But if there's no God, I can't make that claim. The world has no foundation for morality when they throw God out. Just as the world has no foundation for truth when God is taken out of the picture. And now in the last 5 to 10 years, people have been saying the quiet part out loud. Being taught in the classrooms out loud. The things that I thought of and kind of knew even when I was college age and a teenager, but it wasn't necessarily said out loud so boldly as it is today by so many people. There is no truth, choose your own truth, and accept each other's truth is now a common phrase. Was not common when I was young. That was not said nearly as much, if really, in my opinion, could I remember ever anyone saying that to me. Even when I was young, unbelievers, unsaved, had a moral standard of things that were wrong at all times. Even the unsaved understood there was a standard of morality. Now, the world says there is none. They're saying the quiet part out loud. Something that has always been true. Without God, there is no morality. Without God, there is no truth. And so here Pilate is making that statement. Who is truth? What is truth? Well, Christ, of course, already gave the answer, right? I am the way, the truth, and the life. Ye have a custom, he says in verse 39, that I should release unto you one at Passover. Will ye therefore that I release unto you the King of the Jews? Then cried they all again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. John leaves out a part of the trial that is taking place. He doesn't really go into a lot of detail about some of the other events. Obviously, we're given the part about the Sanhedrin where Christ is when he's brought before the high priest, there's the Sanhedrin there as well. It'd be a group of other religious leaders. They're all the ones kind of asking the questions and going through the trial. But in Luke, go ahead and turn there. Luke chapter 23. John, Matthew, and Mark all skip over this pretty important event. Luke 23, when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked, this is verse 6, whether the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod. Pilate is doing whatever he can to pass this on to someone else. His hand is being forced by the Pharisees. The Pharisees are essentially stating, if you let Jesus go, you are letting someone go who claims to be a king. What would the emperor of Rome think of such a thing? How would he feel about this? And Pilate begins to get worried that the emperor would hear that he would let someone like this man claiming to be a king go. So he's thinking, well, maybe Herod can take care of the problem. So he sends him off to Herod. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season. But yet he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracles done by him. Then he questioned him with him in many words, but he answered him nothing, and the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Herod with his men of war set him at naught, mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, sent him again to Pilate, and the same day Pilate and Herod were made friends together. Before that, they were enemies. Jesus, of course, is wearing a robe, and it is the robe that the lots are cast, or the dice is thrown by the soldiers at the cross. And Jesus got this robe as a gift, you might say, from Herod. But it's a gift that Herod is giving to mock Jesus. Jesus claims to be a king, the King of Kings. Although he states, my kingdom is not of this world, Herod does not understand that phraseology. And so Herod says, really, you're king? All right, well, let's dress you like one. They give him a robe and then commence to mock him and belittle him. Jesus is then brought back to Pilate, and then we are essentially back in John, where once Jesus is brought to Pilate, this is where Pilate asks further questions and tries to get information from Jesus to have reason to not put him to death. We're also told in one of the Gospels how Pilate's wife comes to Pilate and warns him and states, I had a dream last night about this man. Essentially, keep your hands off him. Don't mess with him. Nothing good will come from this. Isn't that very merciful of God? That Jesus was going to be crucified, but Pilate didn't have to be part of it. Jesus was going to be crucified, but Judas didn't have to be part of it. Judas wasn't created to do this thing. Judas chose to do it. Pilate wasn't created for this moment. Pilate chose to be part of this event. In fact, I would argue, as I just gave the information, God actually is giving Pilate a way out of this event. That essentially Jesus would have died this day no matter what Pilate said. Someone was going to put Jesus on the cross, but it didn't have to be Pilate. Pilate, due to the fear of men and what they think about him, chose to participate. And ironically, it is Pilate who washes his hand and says, essentially, I have no part of this. But then gives the command to put Jesus on the cross, gives the allowance for the soldiers to do the deed, but says, all right, do this, but I'm not part of it. No, you're the authority. You are part of it. And the illustration of washing your hands does not eliminate your guilt in this act. Barabbas is set free, and Barabbas is set free, and Jesus is put on the cross. Now, we don't exactly know what the people on the cross next to Jesus did. But I do want to turn to Luke 23, verse 24. Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they required, and he released unto him that for sedition and murder was cast into prison. That's Barabbas, whom they had desired, but he delivered Jesus to their will. So it seems that Barabbas was going to be the one on the cross for murder and sedition. And so although we're told that the two on the cross were thieves, it is very possible that these thieves might have done more during their theft than just steal. That equal to Barabbas, they might have actually been involved in some murder as well. In fact, I think some have thought that maybe they were involved with Barabbas. That's in some way that Barabbas and these thieves knew each other, and there might have been some connection between them. We don't know that. The Bible doesn't say that. But I've always considered these thieves were more than just thieves. Now, I could be wrong, and maybe that's all they were. The Bible calls them thieves, and maybe that's the limit of what they were. It seems to me, though, that maybe they were repeat offenders, or maybe they stole from the wrong person, or maybe they stole the wrong thing. I don't imagine in my mind's eye that they were just stealing food, and they were put on the cross for stealing food. That whatever theft they did and whatever else they were involved in, it had to have been a pretty significant deal to put them on the cross. Just like Barabbas was not just one of sedition, meaning he was trying to overthrow the Roman government. He actually was murdering. He probably was an assassin. I've assumed in the past that Barabbas had murdered Roman soldiers, that he was a zealot, and in his effort to overthrow the Roman government had killed Romans, hoping to somehow start a revolution. And that was enough to put him to death as well. All right, so John 19, Jesus is taken by Pilate and scourged or whipped. This is after Herod's meeting, after he is given the robe. He's brought back to Pilate. He's given a crown of thorns. They put it on him. They put on him a purple robe. And so we're told that he already received a gorgeous robe in Luke 23. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's two different robes. It could be they took it off, put it back on him. Or it could mean that he was given two robes. We're not clarified here. But whether he was given two robes or whether the robe was taken off and put back on, he again is just being mocked. The crown of thorns put on his head. His beard is pulled from his face. He is spat upon. He is whipped. We're told that when Jesus is done, the Old Testament gives us a prophecy of what the Messiah will look like. And the Old Testament describes the Messiah at this point in his life as so marred that he is no longer recognized as a human being. He's marred beyond the recognition of a human. You just see a lump of bleeding flesh. This is the physical pain Jesus is suffering. And I don't think that the physical pain came close to the amount of suffering that he will experience with the spiritual pain on the cross. John 19, verse 4, Pilate went forth again, saith unto him, Behold, I bring him forth unto you, that ye may know that I find no fault in him. Then came Jesus forth, wearing a crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate says he has no fault, but he's already had him beaten. He has no fault, but he's already had him mocked. That crown of thorns placed on his head. They said, crucify him, crucify him. He says, take ye and crucify him. I find no fault in him. The Jews answered him, we have a law, and by our law he must die. Verse 8, when Pilate therefore heard that he was the more afraid, went again to the judgment hall, saith unto Jesus, whence thou art? He did not answer. Jesus didn't give an answer. Verse 10, Pilate saith unto him, have power to don't you know I can release you? Jesus says, thou couldst have no power at all against me except it were given thee from above. And from thenceforth Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, if thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. These same Pharisees, by the way, the Pharisees would not have been friends of the Romans. The Pharisees would not have been friends of Caesar. The Pharisees would have been the friends of the common man, which did not like Roman law. They were not fans of their Roman overthrowers. Now, the Sadducees, on the other hand, were more political in their spiritual leadership. The Sadducees liked to rub elbows with the powerful and the rich. I could see the Sadducees saying this. Hey, you better do this thing or Caesar won't appreciate it. That actually falls in line with what we know about the Sadducees. It is completely opposite from what we know about the Pharisees. The Pharisees have chosen to align themselves with their enemies in order to see Christ dead. That goes to show you the power of hatred and bitterness. That you would actually get in bed, per se, with your enemies to see someone that you hate so much killed. The things you would be willing to do, the people you'd be willing to rub elbows with, the levels you'd be willing to stoop down to see Jesus killed. Bitterness truly is a horrible quality, often found in many people, Christians and unbelievers alike. Pilate heard that saying. He brought Jesus forth, sat down in the judgment seat in the place called the pavement, but in the Hebrew, Gabbatha. And it was preparation of the Passover, about the 6th hour. And he saith unto the Jews, behold your king. But they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Saith unto them, Pilate said, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. Then delivered he therefore unto them to be crucified. Matthew tells us in chapter 27, verse 3 through 10, that at this time Judas begins to regret what he did. He goes to we're told in verse 3, repents himself, brought the 30 pieces, throws them at the feet of the spiritual leaders, the priests, and says, I have betrayed innocent blood. They say, what is that to us? You see to that, see thou to it. Hey, our hands are clean. We didn't do it. You did it. It wasn't us. We hired you for a job. You got the job done. If you don't like what you did, that's on you. It's not on us. Throws the money down, leaves it, departs, verse 5, and hangs himself. Now, we're told in another passage of Scripture that Peter, after he hung himself, fell and his bowels broke open. I'm sorry, Judas, excuse me. Thank you. Judas fell and his bowels broke open. And when I've seen this, I've seen it as Judas probably hung there for a while until his body began to rot and no one got his body off the tree. Probably left on the tree for days. Till eventually one of two things happened. The rope broke or his body decomposed to a point where his body fell through the rope. And when he hit the ground, it essentially burst. That's how decomposed his body was. No one wanted to deal with Judas. Well, they were kind of forced to deal with him eventually when his body is exploding on the ground. And they took the 30 pieces of silver that he had cast on the ground. They purchased the potter's field to bury him in. This is where strangers are buried. And Judas is buried a forgotten man. Judas spent his life loving money and the influence and the power that money could buy. He betrayed his best friend, the best friend he'd ever have, for money. And in the end, died and was buried a forgotten man. The love of money, we're told, is the root of all evil. And when you truly do a study of even people today who live for the love of money, it is a heartbreaking thing to see the path of destruction they leave in their marriage, with their kids, in their own life, mental health, spiritual health, emotional health. The path of destruction that they take and leave behind from the love of money. And yet, every generation, millions upon millions of people make the same bad decision, chasing after money rather than chasing after God, the love of God, and the love of people. Going back to John chapter 19, verse 16, they took Jesus, led him away, and he, bearing his cross, went forth into a place called the place of the skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha. They crucified him, two other with him, one on each side, Jesus in the midst. The soldiers crucified Jesus, took his garments, made 4 parts, every soldier a part, also his coat. The coat was without seam, woven from top throughout. They couldn't tear that part, so they said, let's cast lots for it. Excuse me. That the scripture might be fulfilled, which saith, they parted my raiment among them, and for my vesture they did cast lots. These things, therefore, the soldiers did. Pilate wrote a title up on it, on the cross, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. This was Pilate's final way to get back at the Pharisees for forcing him, to get back at the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin and the chief priests for forcing him into this act, his final way of degrading them. And it was an insult for the Pharisees, chief priests, Sadducees, religious leaders to have above the cross of what they would call a blasphemer, hanging there with thieves or worse, for the plaque to say, this is our king. And for Pilate to say, I'm going to kill your king in front of you. In fact, it was requested that that Pilate take this down, that it would not stay up. But Pilate answered in John 19, verse 22, what I have written, I have written. I'm not going to change it. We're going to end there. Next week, I will be out of town. I'll be on a marriage retreat with our church, so we'll get back together the following Wednesday, and my goal is to actually wrap up this series on that next Wednesday. We'll discuss briefly some of the events that took place with Jesus on the cross. We're going to talk about the resurrection of Christ, and then that pretty much sums up our time in the Gospels. Of course, the book of Acts gives us some more details of Christ, but we're not going to be getting into the book of Acts. So we'll get together on September 13th. My plan is to have a business meeting on September 20th over our deacons. And if I'm not able to end the Bible study on September 13th, if there's still more information that I need to give, then we will definitely finish it on September 27th. If I do wrap things up by the 13th, then on September 27th, when we come back, I will begin the introduction to our series on the book of Revelation. Now, our series in the book of Revelation will not just be only in Revelation. There's a whole lot of Old Testament prophecy that is given, that is paired with Revelation, that leads up to Revelation, that lays the foundation for Revelation. So in our series of Revelation, we'll be going to the Old Testament as well and spending a lot of time in the prophecies of Daniel and Isaiah and others as they talk about the end times. And it's not just those two prophets. There's a bunch of prophets who have some great information about the end times. We're going to go back and look at that as it leads up to the book of Revelation. So by the time we're done, you'll have a pretty good knowledge of end-time prophecy from both Old Testament and New Testament, including some passages found in both the Gospels and some of the epistles. So we're going to end now. Thank you so much for joining us online, and we'll see you in 2 weeks when I get back.